No audio, okay. It's not really sure why this is becoming a problem. What? Now you can hear. Not my audio. Can you hear the audio from the courtroom camera? Well, what a crap way to start. Got it checked.
I'm also saying that in her experience, it was unusual for him to come that late.
Can you hear now? Is that better?
Then we have the defendant and his many statements. Went through a lot with the defendant, who told you that the reason why he was telling you this new story was because he was paranoid because he had a bag of pills in his pocket, because he had a distrust of Slynn, because David Owen asked him about his relationship with Maggie. And his law partners told him that he should have an attorney present, which one is in here. One of his law partners is sitting in the back.
I think I have to do this.
I understand.
Yeah.
I totally
Yeah.
understand.
Yeah.
So you don't have any problem with it.
I asked him repeatedly, is this the point where you decided to lie? At which point did you decide to lie?
I hate to have to do this.
I understand.
I didn't mean to do that twice. Or was it this point when he first says, I was at the house?
I was at the house.
Or was this the point? He said, he mentioned specifically, and he kept adding factors, and one of the things was, well, Dave Owen asked me how my relationship was. This question? This is when he decided to lie?
Wonderful. I mean, I'm sure we had little things here and there, but we had a wonderful marriage, wonderful relationship.
But he digs in on the point.
What did you do today? Were you at the office or?
No, I was home. I came home, Paul and I messed around. I was up at the house. I laid down, took a nap on the couch, probably, I don't know, 25, 30 minutes. I got up, I called Maggie, didn't get an answer, and I left to go to my mom's.
So I must say this is really effective. It's so effective right at the end, showing the jury. It's the same video I put up, the 10 red flags in 7 minutes. Remember that video? It was my very first video on this case. And basically showing him at the scene lying on many different fronts why do you need to tell a small lie? Why do you need to tell a big lie? One of the small lies he tells is he says that he slept for 20 minutes to half an hour. When he testified, he actually said it was very, very short. He doesn't actually say how long. I think less than 10 minutes, but he said it was a very short time. And then I think there's another statement where he says he slept for an hour or something like that. But this is really effective to do it right at the end, is to show him lying about small things and big things to law enforcement, and then saying, why would you do that, right?
We should say.
This is June 8th at 1:21 in the morning. And he's admitted to you that he's lying right there. Look how easily he did it. About such a crucial thing.
You even get a sense that Murdaugh himself is reflecting on those words. You kind of get the sense that this is a bit of a reality check for himself, right? And it's very clever of the prosecutor to not only go through all of that, but within the layer of the trial, updating it to what he said in the trial about those statements. You know what I mean? He's kind of updated Murdaugh's version of events of what he said there. And, that takes some skill.
And she's very good about answering the phone, so that was odd, or calling me back. So that was odd, but it wasn't that big a deal.
It was odd, but not that big a deal. But again, he's enough to say it was odd. He's enough to make all those calls while he's doing 283 steps, but he doesn't drive 50 seconds down to the kennels. Going to the next interview. Again, what's the tone of this interview? How is he being treated?
So I want to stop there and just say I am really impressed that he's using this sort of style. It's almost a YouTube kind of style. You looking at video, you don't need to say much more than show the person, show the answers. And the only criticism I've got is I think you want to tell the jury ahead of time how long your closing argument's going to be, and then almost show them almost a framework. We're going to go through A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and right now we're at whatever, E, right? In other words, it's almost like when you read a book, you want to know, well, how long is this chapter, and do you want to read the next chapter? It just guides and I'm obviously telling you this as a narrator, but this is the prosecutor telling a story, and you want to put the reader, in this case the jury, in a safe place where they sort of feel like, okay, this is how much I can invest into listening to you, right? And it's just really good practice as a narrator. So now they're going on to the consciousness of guilt of the next interview. I really wanted to start this off at the beginning where we actually provide slideshows of terms and so on. And then I didn't realize he was going to go on for as long as he is. But anyway, there it is.
Pretty traumatic.
That's okay. I know you need to ask me. You ask me what you need to.
So,
is that an aggressive interview? Is that something that makes somebody paranoid?
I'm a defendant in a civil case involving my son. I told you about the boat wreck.
Yes, sir.
And there were some motions coming up in that on Thursday, and I was mostly just getting ready for those things, and then other junk.
Mentions the boat case.
Paul left.
And I'm assuming, Paul left because of,
Gotcha.
what happened. I mean, I'm assuming Paul went to the kennels.
Okay. And what did you do once Maggie and Paul left?
I stayed in the house.
Okay.
And I was watching TV, looking at my phone, and I actually fell asleep on the couch.
Okay. And what time did you?
I don't know
wake up?
exactly what time I woke up, but when y'all get my phone, I think one of the first things I did when I got up was call Maggie because I was going to my mom.
So one of the things you want to look at when you're dealing with a suspect is you want to look at, you want to kind of compare them having like incredible recall. They can remember incredible detail. A few minutes ago, the prosecutor was saying, well, you can actually remember when your phone fell down the console, right? Incredible detail like that. And then when it comes to critical detail, then they don't remember things, right? And you have that in so many cases. You have people remembering incredibly grainy details, but then when it comes to especially the timeline, oh no, I've got no idea, right? I can't actually tell you.
Mom's, and I know I texted her because I checked my phone. And what time did we say the text was, Jim? It's like 9:06.
I didn't see it. Yeah, I got it written down for you.
I showed you though.
So did you notice that he's just said a very exact time, 9:06, for a text, and that's the text that's supposed to provide him an alibi. I was somewhere else, whatever, right? But when he's sleeping at the couch, which is actually at the time that the murders occur, well, then he's really not sure. A question I would have asked him is, what were you watching on TV? What was on TV when this happened, right? And even if someone says, I don't know, ask them, okay, about how long? Get them to commit to some kind of time frame.
Yes, sir. I got
so, I texted her, so I called her just before that. And I mean, she didn't answer at that point. And I left to go.
So you also want to look at Murdaugh's expression here. It does that with his mouth. I think when he does something like that, that's a sign that he's not terribly happy with what is being said about him. He's quite an emotional character. He can be completely emotionless. He can make wry gestures like that. And then he can also be bawling and all over the place. It's actually quite astonishing.
Go to my mom's.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Good to see you, Marcus.
So easy for him to do.
So the title of this live is Someone Living a Lie. And what I love about what the prosecutor is doing is showing, right, and in critical interviews, just how easily he's lying, right? And then that tells you something about the person you're dealing with. Somebody who lies with difficulty and someone who lies all the time easily. The one is at a different level of going over to the dark side than the other. Do you appreciate that?
And you said you laid down and took a little nap, and when you got up, Maggie and Paul was gone, or did they leave when you laid down?
So that's also quite interesting. I went to sleep, and when I woke up, Maggie and Paul were gone. That is you often hear those words in the context of crime, that someone was gone, which is like, well, they weren't there, but also that they died. There's also so many crimes where somebody dies while I was sleeping, right? And the whole thing with when you're sleeping is you were invisible. You don't need to say what you were doing or you see what I'm saying? There are a lot of cases where it happens while someone was supposedly sleeping.
I believe that I'm not sure.
But they weren't there when you woke up around the 9 o'clock mark or so when you made the call to Maggie to let her know you wanted to.
No, nobody was in that house when I left.
Adding more detail, it's just lies. Watch how he responds to this one. Watch what his head does. See if you observe that yourself when he's over there looking you in your eyes and trying to convince you of something.
Trying to narrow that. The last time that you saw Paul and Maggie's when y'all were eating supper.
Yes, sir.
when Paul's phone came out, did you just pick it up and put it on, place it back down on him, or?
Yeah, I did not try to open it or anything. I don't know how I had in my mind it.
Do you believe that? Now, what is really a strong statement made earlier, and it's one that, excuse me, I make repeatedly, is how come the suspect in this case can't remember the last conversation he had with his wife and son? Because they supposedly had dinner together. How come the suspect in this case doesn't talk about the last words? Because that is something you tend to remember. It kind of runs in a track in your brain over and over and over again. If you've lost someone that you love, that you care about, then you keep that sort of memories burned in your mind, and you don't get that from him. You don't get him saying, this is what she said and whatever, right? You don't get it with a lot of perpetrators. Chris Watts, you also don't get, well, the last thing she said to me was this.
I needed to not mess anything up. I had that,
Yeah, it would.
Going to the third interview on August 11th.
And after dinner, Maggie and Paul went to the kennel.
So again, look at the expression on Alex Murdaugh's face, the Alex Murdaugh in court. Do you think he's pleased to see these three different interviews juxtaposed next to each other? And there's slight variations in it, but it's all dealing with consciousness of guilt, right? Is there a sense that there's consciousness of guilt going on, right? And then look at his expression as well, with this being put into the jury's court, the ball put into the jury's court in this sense.
I don't know exactly how that went. I stayed on the couch and I dozed off.
Video on Paul's phone.
So what you actually have here is, I think, three separate times when he's talking to law enforcement that he says he was at the house and he dozed off. But then in court, he didn't say that. In court, he said, no, I actually was there, right? I think he does say that he slept for I don't know, he says extremely short. He lay on the couch for an extremely short time. That's something I would want to juxtapose, is where he says an hour, and then when he says, 20 minutes, and then he says, I would also want to juxtapose that.
You and him on the farm that night, and you were in khaki pants and a dress shirt. You were playing with a tree.
I don't remember playing with a tree.
Yeah, I guess there was a tree sapling or something that had fallen over or bending over, and you were trying to get it to stand up. But I mean, the question in that is, when I met you that night, you were in shorts and a t-shirt. At what point in that evening did you change clothes?
I'm not sure. It would have been
Before dinner or after dinner?
No, it would have been. What time of day was that? I would have thought I'd already changed.
So can you see how that's an incredibly hard question for him to answer? Can you just tell me, we can see you did change. Can you tell me when you changed? And this is a very hard question for him to answer. It shouldn't be, right? You would think for an innocent person, you'd say, well, I've changed, whatever. On the other hand, it's a very loaded question if you're not an innocent person, because you would have changed immediately after you'd done something, right? Can you see how that is a seemingly silly, insignificant question to ask? And if you asked anybody else, when did you change? If you asked me, when did I change into this shirt? It would be, a couple of minutes ago. There wouldn't be any question about it. But for him, it's a really tough question to answer. Why? Why is that? And then the question is, doesn't that show consciousness of guilt?
There's not a timestamp on it because there's so many posts. But I want to say it looks to be
Yeah,
about
that's right.
dusk.
That's right.
And 7:30, 8 o'clock.
I guess I changed when I got back to the house.
You see the lack of conviction. I guess I changed when I got back to the house. I think strictly speaking, that's true. I think when he got back to the house, he did change. But as Marcus says, in court, he sort of fondly recalls this bonding moment with his son, right? Planting trees, and they laughed because they were sort of hanging over, and now he doesn't remember it at all, right? It's quite a difference. Again, why on a detail like that can you not remember things?
I had some very specific recollections for y'all when he testified with his new story that had never been heard until last week.
So there again, if you look at Murdaugh's, the expression on his face when he looks at the prosecutor making that statement and he looks back, can you see the resentment on his face?
And Rogan Gibson told me about the dog's tail and somebody saying his leg was broken.
Line right there. He was down at the kennels, shaking his head forward.
You were just down there with Paul. You left.
So yeah, I tried to catch it there twice. He's actually looking down in court. He's actually looking down, and that is I suppose you could say a sign of defeat. I suppose you could say that, but you don't often actually see him looking down. You tend to see him looking out. He's very engaged with the testimony, and now you're actually starting to see him looking down.
You went back to the house for dinner.
You know, I mean, Paul and I were just knocking around up at the shop, the shed, the kennels, and just the whole property. And that was before dinner yesterday.
So there you have him looking down. He's not looking at the monitor. The monitor's here. He's looking down, I would imagine, at his hands. Right? Can you see there's a bit of a body language in court as well?
And you didn't go back down there after dinner until you were...
Stephanie, thanks for joining us.
Yes, sir.
I've got information that Paul was on the phone and Maggie was heard in the background and you were heard in the background.
So I don't know if you caught that as well. After the officer in the clip says, and you were caught in the background, again, he looks down. Now, let me ask you a question. Do you agree that that recording is probably, if Murdaugh is convicted of murder, that would be crucial to that? And if you took that recording away, do you think you would still have that? And obviously, we're not there yet. He hasn't been convicted yet. The jury haven't decided. But assuming the jury do convict him, if you took that recording away, do you think that they would still convict him? That's, to me, a very difficult and troubling question, because you shouldn't need video evidence and sound evidence to find somebody guilty. It's an absurd it's an absurd standard to expect in every case. It's totally absurd. But I think you've got to ask that question. If you didn't have that, what would be the outcome of this case? We don't know what the outcome is, but just something worth thinking about.
That was prior to 9 p.m.
I heard Rogan Gibson ask me if I was up there, and he said he thought it was me.
Was it you? Yes.
Chelsea, welcome.
No, sir. Not if my times are right.
Who do you think it could have been?
I have no idea.
And Rogan's been around your family for pretty much all his life.
Oh, absolutely.
So still, can you see how he's looking down? It's quite interesting. His lawyers aren't even looking down. At this moment that I've frozen it, he's looking at the screen, but he's looking down quite a lot. Do you think his heart is sinking?
And he recognizes your voice, and you have a distinct voice.
There it is again, right? There it is again. I just find that really interesting.
Do you think anybody else that has a voice similar to yours that he may have misinterpreted?
No, sir. You know, when we were talking, he had asked me that. So, I mean, he had told me that he thought I was up there.
Did that surprise you?
Yes, sir.
So I don't know if you caught that Rogan, who was the recipient of Paul's video, or of Paul's, actually not 100% sure of this, but Paul's friend Rogan actually heard Alec Murdaugh at the kennels as well, right? So anyway, so you can see at the bottom here is juxtaposed the three different Alex Murdaughs, but basically the three different versions. And each one on its own is actually quite convincing. And you have the same in the in so many cases as well. John Benet Ramsey in the Amanda Knox case, when you take individual stories on their own, okay, you know, that kind of makes sense. But then a little bit more evidence comes to light, or information comes to light, or context comes to light. And then you ask them another story, and then there's actually a slightly different version. And the skill of an investigator is to be able to remember those little details. Not everyone can, and then match the mismatches, and that's when the sort of cockpit lights start going on. Why are there all these little inconsistencies in little things? And good liars know how to tell you kind of what you want to hear in a way that it sort of squashes all the little questions you have. The problem is even a good liar can't deal with their own inconsistencies. Does that make sense? So there's again quite a big what's the word? I don't know. It's a kind of expression on his face that doesn't look like it's going terribly well with him.
You come back to that. But I want to talk a little bit about the crime scene. What it is.
So I don't actually know whether Murdaugh is actually taking notes. It's the end of the trial, but maybe he wants to. He wants his defense lawyer to untangle this or that or whatever in his closing. That's kind of the benefit that the defense having going second. Something else I want to mention is the fact that I'm not sure if there's a difference between American law and South African law, but in South African law, once the prosecution rests, then if the defendant is going to testify, they need to testify first. It's very unusual in South African law that the defendant will allow their own witnesses to testify first and then come in at the end of it. Henry van Breda did that, and the judge actually mentioned that that was irregular and not a good look. Well, you have the same situation here. So I don't know if you guys know court cases very well, trials very well. Do the defendants typically go on first? Is that usual? Is that typical?
Indicates. I want to advise everyone there will likely be sealed exhibits. I don't need the elmo quite yet. Thank you. I'll let you know, sure. You guys went out to the scene today.
So again, look at Murdaugh's body language. He's sort of touching his face. Do you think he's confident? And now basically what the prosecutor is doing, again, it's a strong statement. He's showing photos of the crime scene. And I would tell you, I've written a lot of true crime books. When you see photos, crime scene photos, I see a lot of crime scene photos, autopsy photos that you guys never see, and you kind of hope you do never see them, that burn themselves into your mind. And when you see that, it's the sort of thing you don't see in the mainstream media. It's the sort of thing you don't see in social media, or you shouldn't. And it's the sort of thing you only see in a courtroom, and the reporters there aren't even allowed to show it. And it is very disturbing. And you realize in an instant the destruction that someone, you might say, this person didn't commit the crime, that person didn't commit the crime, evidence this, evidence that. But when you look at someone who's died and you look at their injuries, somebody did that, right? Someone did something to these people. And when you see what they did, and it's not like a small little harmless injury, this cost this person their life. Their life is permanently over and will always be. Everything they have, they've lost because of somebody else. You get a rising sense of anger and sort of indignation is too weak a word, about the injustice of what that person experienced. And as I say, nobody actually gets to see those things. And this is what he's doing now. He's showing the jury these basically horrible images of the crime scene. And that's a very good way to end the thing on, because that's the sort of thing the defense would want to sanitize, minimize, euphemize. So emphasize that as the prosecutor. Show them these pictures. Do you think the perpetrator wants the jury to see what he did? I'm talking about in terms of the dead bodies. Do you think he wants them to see that, or he doesn't want them to see that? And so the prosecutor showing that is a strong ending, right? Strong closing.
And you saw how it looks now. Take a good look at those trees and where they were back in the day of the incident. I'll put this up on the elmo in a second. And you can see the proximity of the kennels to that residence.
So I'm sure you've been watching this case and you know what's going on. They're covering over those screens to protect, the integrity of the case from reporters and so on and whatever. But all the people who don't see this evidence, well, the jury does, and that's kind of the most important aspect. But can you see how sanitized a narrative is anyway, even when it's put in on trial and made explicit? It's still sanitized in a way, and that always favors the defendant.
Back on June 7th, 2021. Get out the elmo, please. What's up, Counselor? Thank you.
Okay, so while we're waiting, let's have a look at the votes.
You have the PowerPoint back, please.
Please vote if you haven't already. Let's just have a look at what the votes are looking like.
There's not any images in the PowerPoint that I understood, but I do have these right here.
It's pretty even, Stevens. Most,
All right, Dr.
most
Reamer,
say 9 out
you've
of
heard-
10. Okay.
From Dr. Reamer, you heard from Kenny Kinsey, and you heard from the defense experts. So, do you have the computer back?
Someone was saying he barely looks affected by looking. That's quite interesting, this sort of thing. Quite interesting.
Paul?
Often with murderers, when they are seeing their handiwork, they actually might smile, right? They might actually, you might actually see duping delight, which is shocking to see that. It's you look at that and you would almost imagine that they would, I don't know, not smile, something else, right? And that's the part that's actually quite shocking, is that there's this sort of duping delight on something as macabre as that. And so look out for that. See if you see anything like that with Murdaugh. Any smiles in the middle of this? Does he need to have a word with his co-counsel in the middle of talking about injuries?
First blast to the chest, stippling, arms down, not fatal for a buckshot blast to the chest.
Okay, I'm not quite sure why I went through that so quickly, but something that you need to emphasize when it's a potential family annihilation is if it's a stranger that is involved, then you kind of have a situation where what are you doing here? And you should have a defensive situation, right? So someone should run away or scream or try and defend themselves, but obviously in a situation where it's your own father, your own husband, family member, you really don't expect them to murder you, which also tells you a lot about the crime scene. The fact that if you look at where Paul's body was lying and where Maggie's body was lying, they're really not that far away from one another, right? If someone came onto that property with a gun and you saw that person, wouldn't they have gotten much, much further away than if it's someone that they know and they're used to that person carrying guns? You know what I mean?
This is where there was some dispute from the defense experts. The second injury went into the left shoulder, into the cheek.
The fact that the shot on Paul was instantly fatal shows that the perpetrator could take his time. He was in a comfortable spot. He could aim and be sure of getting, that kind of precise shot. Could a perpetrator who was unknown to the family running into the scene have the same luxury of being able to raise the weapon, choose their moment in the same way if it was a family member?
With an exit wound on the top of the head, with instantly fatal and terminal collapse. Dr. Reamer's done 5,500 autopsies. She does an independent autopsy. She actually physically examined the victim, and she was very clear that it could not have happened from the top without destroying Paul's face. And I can show the image again. I'm reluctant to because I know y'all have seen it enough. So I'll rely on y'all to recall that his face was intact. I'll rely on y'all to recall, and this is sealed, all the evidence up top here.
So look at Alex Murdaugh. He's now getting quite emotional. He probably would like the jury to look at him rather than at those photos. Can I ask you guys a question? Do you think any of the victims in this case were shot from the front? Were they facing the perpetrator, or did they have their backs to the perpetrator? The reason I say that is in the Chris Watts case, you also had a father and husband, and I believe he killed Shanann with her looking the other way because he didn't want that memory singed into his mind of her looking at him while he's doing something. And I think that the same applies in this case. It's just a hunch. It's just intuition.
At the top of the door. I will rely on y'all to recall Kenny Kinsey's testimony that buckshot don't reverse course.
So in terms of Maggie facing the perp, as far as I know, she was first shot in the leg and then she was like on her knees. Isn't that so? Anyway, it's interesting to think about.
The kinetic energy is going in one direction. I'll rely.
Yeah, so in terms of the final shot wasn't face to face, the final shot wasn't face to face. I think the first shot was her realizing Paul had been shot and she's being a good mother trying to protect her son, only to realize, well, now her life is in danger, right?
I on y'all to recall all the biological matter that you see at the top of this door.
Rhea, good to see you. Timmy, I'm going to put you down.
I'll rely on y'all to recall, looking at states 339, which is the wadding from the shot to kill Paul. Because if you recall, the wadding from the chest shot was found still in his chest right here. This is the wadding on the.
So can you see how the photographer, the cameraman, has cropped this image so that you see the prosecutor, but it's sort of cropped so that you can't see the image. That's kind of done intentionally.
Ground from the shot to his head. And one of the things that you recall from Dr. Reamer's testimony and looking at Paul's face was the abrasions around that cheek wound that came from the wadding as it entered there.
So again, look at Alex Murdaugh. The thing I'm missing in this little sideshow is where's the white tissue? I'm expecting to see, that kind of thing. Something tells me we're going to see a white tissue quite soon. Here is actually a you can't see it, thank goodness, but here is a instance where those photos are actually visible in this distant shot. You can't really see it because it seems like it's a zoomed in injury, but there it is.
You heard from Dr. Reamer that the reason for the shape on the shoulder was because it went along the shoulder and opened up that area there, but still was focused and then expanding as it entered in here. But she also testified that if it was here, that force would not have left his face intact. Manner of death, homicide.
Okay, we're going to get to that. I want to just respond to this statement. I think he would have faced them and verbalized that it was their fault. Kind of, look what you made me do, I believe. Do you guys agree with that? Like, that is a totally different interpretation. So first of all, I don't think the evidence supports that. But the other thing is, do you think Alec Murdaugh, the kind of person he is, this personality is someone who is like, I'm going to be honest with you and tell you this is what you did, and this is what you're doing, and this is why I'm doing something. And bear in mind the motive here is to kill two people. So you need to catch at least one by surprise, and you also need to, the one that you catch by surprise is the one that is the greater threat to you. You can imagine if Maggie was shot first, Paul, who's kind of a young buck, could basically dodge and possibly try and get himself out of that situation. So does it make sense to do it the way that it was done, right? So I just think sometimes we have a very different way of seeing the same evidence. You must try and think about and acknowledge how some of those differences make sense and so how some of them don't make sense. And it's important to acknowledge those differences because you then come closer, because you've got to defend your perspective. You come closer to knowing the case a lot better. It's got to stand up to scrutiny.
Then you heard from Dr. Kenny Kinsey. What we described earlier, Paul was first shot in the feed room, largely agrees with her. Arms were not up. He believes the shot was a little closer and the lack of stippling could be chalked up.
So that is quite interesting that Paul's arms were not up, and the defense were basically saying that it was like hands up kind of thing, like an intruder came there and confronted them.
To the black T-shirt, but also agrees, as she does, no defensive wounds. Looking at the blood spatter locations there, and he testified in great detail and testified yesterday, there was no high velocity blood spatter on the ground at the entrance to the feed room, which would be necessary for the shot to have occurred in the manner in which the defense suggested.
That's also a great argument. I know the defense were talking about angles and so on. It's not something you would think about. There's blood spatter on clothing, there's blood spatter there. Well, what about on the ground if the shot, the trajectory was downward? So that is quite a good counter to that.
The spatter travels upward in an upward direction, and you can see that on the door. He spoke of the void area, and then he spoke of the blood on the ground that was around where Paul drops, and that it's low-speed spatter. He talked about the dents in the feed room door, the pellet lodged in the door frame upward. It's only possible if it's traveling through Paul's head. Not possible if it's from a ricochet, as the defense suggested.
So I find it quite interesting that Murdaugh seems quite cerebral here. His face isn't red, he's not emotional. Well, no photos are being shown. So when there's a recounting of information, even if it's incredibly graphic like you're hearing, then he seems to be fine. He certainly seems to be fine here. When you show a photo, then suddenly he needs a glass of water and he sort of does that thing. It's interesting. And I think you've got to ask the question, is he trying to get you not to look? Is he trying to distract you? Is he trying to get you to look at him? We had that with the Oscar case. Whenever you had very, very graphic evidence, Oscar would always drown it out, even if he wasn't on the stand, he'd drown it out with himself bursting into tears, and they'd always have to adjourn. So every time he tried to get to that part of the evidence, it would be interrupted, drowned out, and there'd be a transfer of attention from the expert to Oscar. And you could say, well, what a silly thing to do, but you could actually argue that it worked, that the judge did have sympathy for him. Bear in mind, in South Africa, we have judges, deciding verdicts, and not juries.
And steel is much less malleable than lead. What else did he say?
So do you think he had dirt in his eye? Do you think he's doing this because he's got dirt in his eye? Or do you think it's to suggest that he's wiping away a tear?
Dr. Kinsey said that he, I think, 3 dozen.
So one way to juxtapose this is look at what he's doing, right? He's the suspect. And look at all the people behind him. Are they fidgeting the same way he is? Are they looking down the same way he is? Are they touching their faces the same way he is? Are they touching their eyes and nose the same way he is?
Times that he's observed contact wounds to the head with a shotgun, including one that happened in front of him, actually observed it. And he also said that any sort of contact wound like that would have destroyed the head and destroyed the face. And he was clear about that. He's actually seen them. And I think what you see with the defense experts is they're coming to you with absolutes to try to make you consider that there's the possibility that a crime scene can definitively establish whether there's 1 or 2 shooters or whether or not they're of a certain height. And that's just not how it works. And you heard that from Dr. Kinsey. That's not how it works. Not how it worked in this scene.
So what's always interesting is you have a narrative from the prosecution, which you could argue is either the authentic narrative or it's closer to what really happened. But what's always important in a case like this is whether it's coming from the defense or the prosecution. It is important to have a narrative. And so the narrative from the defense is that there were 2 shooters and they couldn't have been very tall, blah, 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 blah. And I think that was the weakness in the Oscar Pistorius case, was that the narrative from the prosecution didn't explain things like an argument, whereas Oscar could say what the dynamics were, things like that. You need to be able to match one narrative with another narrative, and your narrative needs to be better, right?
It's a red herring.
So again, look at the look on his face. We're doing that again.
Ladies and gentlemen.
He did it twice.
It's a red herring.
And again, and again.
You've seen the testimony from Kenny Kinsey.
So if you think about it, he's a lawyer, and this lawyer is saying it's a red herring. All of this is a red herring. Do you think that kind of would want to make him smile? Is that this is how we're going to try and mislead the jury? Do you think that that's something that he gets a kick out of, that idea? What do you think? We're looking at his body language. What do you think?
He returned to talk about these issues. You saw the demonstration over there in the doorway? That seem realistic to you? Or is Kenny Kinsey's explanation consistent with the evidence, consistent with his experience, consistent with Dr. Reamer's 5,500 autopsies who actually observed the victims, consistent with the blood spatter, the lack of high velocity on the floor, but the existence of high velocity on the top and the low velocity blood splatter on the floor? What's consistent with the evidence? Maggie. Again, no defensive wounds. The first 2 shots to her abdomen and her leg on a parallel path and likely in close succession. Stippling, close range, the mark on the back of her leg. Running to her baby, didn't see it coming. Bends over, maybe on her hands and knees in pain. You saw me demonstrate that with both.
So what's also worth noting here is, why are the shots to Paul totally different from the shots to Maggie? You can even say, why 2 different weapons? And what I think is quite interesting with that is, if you say, well, if Paul is shot first, right, he starts off as pretty much stationary and you know where he is, you know where the target is, right? And then Maggie, as soon as this happens, Maggie is the one that is now activated and she's moving. She's a moving target. And so the first shot to Maggie is to the abdomen and thigh. What is trying to, and bear in mind, if you look at the image behind me, let's just bring that up quickly. If you bring if you bear in mind that the Murdaughs are hunters, they know how to shoot animals. They've got experience shooting hogs and whatnot, right? And so what you first want to do is wound the animal and then the rest. And isn't that exactly what has happened here?
Dr. Reamer and Kenny Kinsey. And that's when she suffers that third rifle injury. And you heard their expert come in and say, no, it had to be going this way instead of this way. Going up with that graze, hitting her breast and into her head here. And Dr. Reamer actually performed the autopsy physically. She looked at the hole. She described the hole. She talked about the injury coming up into the head. And she showed you that. And she took issue with this idea that you can look at.
That's also a very interesting point. You know, I don't know whether I would say that someone had two guns there to impute to perpetrators. I don't know whether I would, I don't know whether that is premeditated, whether it's like, that's what I want people to think. I kind of tend to agree that because the Murdaughs are gun specialists in a way. So this idea of this gun is better for this situation or this scenario, and this gun is better for that scenario. What do you guys think of that?
Skin tags and that sort of thing and come to any conclusion about directionality. But what she told you is, I looked at this wound. I saw the hole as it went up into the brain. This was an entrance wound up into the head. Instantly fatal and terminal collapse. The wrist wound could have been an extraneous wound, or it could be associated with this. Third rifle injury, and then, of course, the fourth rifle injury to the back of the head.
So another point that you don't hear about, I think, enough is this idea of if Alex Murdaugh was sleeping, or if he was not absent from Moselle, surely you would have heard almost like fireworks. There's so many gunshots. There's, you know, so many shots going off. He had to have heard that, right? And I don't know, did they do that in this case? Did they do sound recreation where they measured the sound at the kennels and whether what you could hear from a certain distance away? But the point is, if Alex Murdaugh was there, that he would have heard those sounds. And I think that's why the TV's on. The TV's on in his story to drown out those sounds. But again, that's something you could test out. You could go to the house and, you know, fire from that area. And bear in mind, there's natural soundproofing with regard to the forest and the structures and so on. Well, but still, would you really not hear that number of shots? Because I think he said he heard a car pull up. So if you hear a car pull up, why wouldn't you hear loud bangs, right?
The canyon effect would have been instantly fatal, except for the fact that this one, there has to be some clearance for that third shot to come up. Again, manner of death is homicide.
It's an interesting point.
So what did Dr. Kinsey say? Again, he took issue with an expert coming in and trying to tell you that he can determine the location or the height of the shooter in this manner. He told you the cardboard, that cannot be relied upon. And while he did agree with the angle on the doghouse, he showed you how changing the aspect of the shooter can easily fit with Alec. And that.
Did you see quite a reaction from him? Almost like he's I don't know what he said at that moment, but he actually said something in response. And you actually have a similarity to the Oscar Pistorius case, where it was hard to say whether he was standing. Bear in mind, Oscar's got a different height when he's got his prosthetic limbs on to when he doesn't. And in a way, that aspect to that case has a similarity to this one, because Alex Murdaugh is a particularly tall guy. I think he's almost 6'4", and that is, in terms of the ballistics, a significant line of evidence either way.
It is too far and way out over its skis to try to assert that you can determine from such information that the shooter had to be 5'2". That's not what you can do. Dr. Kinsey is a crime scene analyst. How many crime scenes did he say he'd done? Hundreds of homicides, thousands of pieces of evidence, real world stuff. That's what he comes and talks about. And you simply can't make those determinations in a real world environment to come in here and try to tell you that from that sort of thing, the shooter had to be a particular height. You just can't do it. You can't do it. I submit to you that Dr. Kinsey knows what he's talking about, and Dr. Kinsey has the years of experience in real-world applications of crime scenes to make those judgments. And I also submit to you that Dr. Kinsey isn't going to get out over his skis and try to make assertions to you in absolutes. The guy with the 5'2" people refused to even concede the possibility of variables. But Dr. Kinsey knows that that's how reality works, and he's not.
It's really interesting the way he's talking about reality. I talk about reality a lot as well. I'm not quite sure what you mean by, would this make a difference, and is this a lawful idea? I'm not quite sure what you mean. What do you mean by that? Terry, good to have you here. Susan as well, welcome.
Not going to get out of over his skis and try to tell you something that simply cannot be supported by the evidence. And that's what the defense expert did. The shooter could easily be 6'4" or taller and fit all those bullet trajectories. Of course, one thing that the defense expert didn't consider and wouldn't even consider is all his little gray people are holding the guns down like this. No consideration of kneeling, of sitting, of being in any sort of different position. But the reality is, these are fluid. Maggie is running to her baby. She's moving. And when she gets hit, most likely when she hits her leg against that Polaris, there was biological evidence on that Polaris. And she comes forward and collapses as Alec is moving around her, firing.
So that came very close to a smile. And there was a moment just before that as well. I'm really sorry I didn't catch when they showed this slide. Hopefully they show it again. But here he's talking about exactly what I was saying about after Paul is shot, everything is fluid. And in a fluid situation, you don't want a shotgun. In a fluid situation, you want, we know which weapon that they used, the AR-15.
They had that expert come in yesterday, and I've kind of mentioned this, but I'll mention it again, who came in.
No, there won't be a book on the Murdaugh case, certainly not within the next 10 years, sorry.
And yesterday,
quite a lot of facial movement there again.
the day before, even I've lost track of time at this point. But try to get out over his skis again and testify to you.
Can you see he looks like he kind of wants to smile? Because bear in mind, there's a thing with, you see it quite often in true crime, the smile eventually does come out. They hold it back, and eventually it does come out.
That it had to be two shooters because there were two guns. And why would you not just use the blackout? Is that opinion helpful or makes sense? Knowing what you know about this case and knowing what you know about the firearms of this particular house and knowing what you know about Alec Murdaugh as you look at the rest of this evidence and what he's trying to manufacture to confuse these issues. Kenny Kinsey told you that it's just as likely that it could be one shooter and sorry, where's the and although this is not to scale, the feed room right here, Blair's is right here. And the cases, while they can't be relied upon as specific location.
So there you get a sense of the location. Let's do it like that. That's where Paul was lying. And you kind of get the idea. I don't know what you guys think, but doesn't it seem like someone may have been standing here? So he kind of came out of a doorway and then he was shot from behind because it's impossible to really see through here. I think there may be a window here, or is the window there? But basically, my impression was that the shooter was standing somewhere here and is familiar with this whole setup, right? And so chose a moment where Maggie was out of sight. And when he came out there, right? And then from this position, he could then also locate, move as well, but also locate Maggie, right? Okay.
They still can be illustrating general area, and they're all in that area, moving from here to here.
So something I respect from you guys, because I looked at the chat on one or two other channels, is you just see people like this contest. Some people going guilty and 10 exclamation marks, and then others saying not guilty. We want to first listen to the case. I mean, that's the end thing, and that's really up to the jury. And I really appreciate that you guys aren't so childish. I mean, it's really not necessary, and it's not really right to be doing that sort of thing. If Alec Murdaugh is found not guilty, and he finds people who've been saying that, you could be in trouble. You really could be in trouble. Welcome, Victoria. Good to see you.
GSR on the defendant's hand and the seatbelt.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a 15-minute break. We'll go to the jury room. Please do not discuss the case.
Okay, let's just see if we can get back to the 15 minutes. Quite a long closing argument.
You'll have an opportunity to fully argue during a time where the jury's attention span won't be frayed due to the long hours.
Your Honor, are you considering dealing with that other matter if we, for instance, adjourn? I think that,
Yes.
okay, because I think the Attorney General's thinking he's going to be done in about 45 minutes, but.
Other less than that,
Or longer. Thank you, Your Honor.
Okay. Did you say you'll be done in how many minutes, or do you know?
I think less than 30, Your Honor.
Less than 30. I thought I heard 4 or 5. Less than 30.
So one of the things that I find fascinating is the way prosecutors and defense attorneys sometimes will the way they pace certain things. So that they might argue something and then they finish arguing at a certain point, and then at the same time where you'll have an adjournment, and then all of that information sinks in. You don't really want to argue something and then allow the opposing counsel to stand up and rubbish your argument. You want to allow there to be a bit of a break between your argument and the opposing counsel's arguments. It's really fascinating how they sometimes play with time, and I wouldn't be surprised if the prosecutor in this case has timed the length of his closing to leave a certain amount of time at the end of the day that would almost force the defense to rush or to have compromised the concentration of the jury. So by the time the defense come on, it's like, oh, I'm really so tired of this. Let's convict this guy already. Do you know what I mean? So he wants to time it so that it is long enough that it puts pressure on the defense. You know what I'm saying? I don't know whether that is the case here, but you do sometimes see that. And it's a very interesting strategy, using time and pacing as part of your legal strategy. It definitely is quite interesting.
Okay. All right, let's bring them in.
So the jury are coming in now. Let's greet some of the people here. Fiona, the Crypto Zoo, says, yeah, that is very disturbing. That's the last thing she saw before she died. Very disturbing. And, you know, she had this intuition that she didn't really want to be there that day. Do you remember that? Yeah, it is an art. Absolutely. It is an art. It's one of those things that a lot of people don't know, that is a strategy that's going on to, it's a kind of mind fuckery or mind, I don't want to say manipulation, influence, because it does definitely influence you. Wow, the jury are taking quite a long time to get back here. Do you guys want me to do Van Gogh letters after this half hour? Those who are on the Team Peachtree channel?
Okay, thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. May I please record?
Sir.
So this should be the last half hour.
GSR on the defendant's hands and seatbelt, Maggie's DNA on that Super Black Eagle, DNA on the Suburban steering wheel, no DNA or blood identified on the floorboards.
So one thought that I've had that I've never communicated before is this thought I had of you kind of have a bloodbath scenario at the kennels, right? And then there's kind of like a cut in terms of the narrative where we find out later that Alec Murdaugh apparently carried a something that was either a tarpaulin or a raincoat, or just both of them, under his arm into his parents' house in Almeida. Now, the thing that I wonder about is, so first of all, you would ask the question, is this a premeditated crime? I believe it was. I think the premeditation had been building, but I also think the events of that day, being told that, you know, at work that he owed whatever the amount was it 300,000 or whatever it was? And then also the impending events, you know, that there was going to be a forensic audit 3 days later, right? So I think there was like a slow burn, gradual process that was turning gears, but then I also think there was premeditation that was gaining speed on the 7th, right? And then, because I think you could ask the question, when did Alex Murdaugh ask Paul and Maggie to come to Moselle? Was this a month before that he invited them? Was it a week before? Was it the day before? Was it the same day? So anyway, so if you acknowledge that it is premeditated, and you say, couldn't part of that premeditation have been staging the aftermath? In other words, I know I'm going to come back from the kennels covered in blood. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a tarpaulin, or I'm going to put plastic, whatever it is, on the ground of my home, so that when I arrive home, I'm already cleaning up the crime scene, right? In other words, I'm going to, and he may even had that near his vehicle or something, where he could stand on a plastic sheeting or tarpaulin, take all his clothes off, put them in there, bundle it in, and then go home, shower, and then get changed into other clothing. That would be one Dexter-like way to minimize the transfer of evidence and the evidence narrative, right? And so, yeah, they say no DNA or blood identified on floorboards.
Showing y'all state 7. That's the how you doing comment. And the second officer walks up, how you doing? States 5. Also from the body cam. It's very dark out there. You can see how well lit it can be when the lights are on. 22. 93. 47. I'm almost done. We'll talk finally a little bit more about the defendant's story to you that he told on Thursday. We've already talked about.
Okay, so we're going to get to that in a second. So it may be unfair to say this, and maybe if I was a trial lawyer, I wouldn't be that different. I would hope that I would be, but in triathlon, you try to minimize your transitions. You do a swim, and then you transition from swim to bike, and you try and do that transition as fast as possible, and then you transition from bicycle to running. All of this involves changing your clothing and all that kind of thing. I think in a trial situation, you want to do the same thing. You don't want to waste time flapping through pieces of paper, trying to find somewhere on a computer screen or whatever. You must think of whether it's a judge or a jury's attention as this precious resource. You want to try not waste a second of their time. It's almost like you're making a movie, and the entire movie's got to be like on script, on a very tight plot. And every time you waste time, you in a way shoot yourself in the foot. That I think should be like criminal law 101. And I don't think it is applied really very well, where lawyers seem to think that they've got all the time in the world. And even though when they're aware that they don't have all the time in the world, they still take a lot of time to do basic things. And, it almost needs to be like what the jury is used to, a TV show, or an appearance in the theater. The show needs to keep going without these white noise moments. And this is just one of them that we've gone through. Ideally, you want a closing argument that starts and ends in one go, and it's kind of like a narrative, and it builds up to a climax, and it's done. He's in a way ruining his own, and he's done quite a good closing, and you might say it's too long You can't write a book like that where you say this book must be read in one sitting, and so I'm going to, sometimes you do need to go through all of those details. So you might say that part's unfair to say. I do think he's going to wow them at the end, and hopefully we're going to get there in the next couple of minutes. That is actually the most important, is how he starts off and how he does at the end. Movies are the same. That's what you tend to remember about closing arguments.
About it. Just a couple more things. I asked him when he went down there, those dogs are clearly out in the kennel video. I asked him if the dogs were alerting on anybody nearby or in the woods, as dogs do. And he said no.
So
he said that.
So on paper, I think that's quite a good argument, but I must say, if any of you have heard the graphic or heard and watched the graphic raw video of the body cam, where you actually have law enforcement officers who are strangers to that scene, you don't really hear all the dogs barking. So something that you would anticipate, and I think it is hypothetically a fairly good argument to field as a prosecutor, even though it's not necessarily true, it's quite a strong argument. The facts of this case don't really show that when there are strangers on the scene that the dogs go nuts. You don't actually see that. You would expect that, but you don't actually see that.
Their dogs were not doing that. You heard about the fact that he changed clothes.
So we'll come back to that. So that is so true. One of the ways you can raise doubt is by being confusing, by being so drawn out. So in other words, you can have a super strong case, but if you take so long to present it and your juror falls asleep or just tunes out, well, then you've created confusion just by virtue of being long-winded, right?
And you also heard testimony that his clothes smelled fresh and like laundry. See, again, manufacturing the scene. You heard from his law partners.
Thanks a lot for your comment, Gayla. So do you guys agree with her? Do you agree that Alec thought it was merciful? Do you guys agree with that? Do you think Alex was thinking about the welfare of Paul and Maggie when he shot them to death the way that he did? Do you think he was being kind and considerate and sympathetic?
That he was not, and also for Marion, that he was not overly concerned.
So Bria agrees with that. So do you honestly think that do you think if Paul or Maggie, their ghosts were here and you could ask them, you know what, I'm glad I died because I'm better off this way, would you feel that way? I don't know. I find it a bit strange that you give Murdaugh that much credit. I mean, he's someone who doesn't care about the feelings of others in terms of stealing their money, the housekeeper, over and over again.
With figuring out what happened or any threats to Buster. And in fact, you heard in the telephone interview after the side of the road, they specifically asked him, are there any threats to Buster? And he said no. Why is there no threat to Buster? Because he was the threat to Maggie and Paul. He knows there's no vigilante out there. That's why he was never concerned about it.
So you may remember I put up a video, Alec Murdaugh's biggest mistake, and I think it's gotten like 82,000 views. This is exactly what it was. If Murdaugh's right, in other words, if his story is true, that there's not actually one but two vigilantes out there, why didn't he act like that, right? So it's one thing to have a defense scenario, right? It's one thing to have that. But then if your own actions don't match up with that, and you had that in the Amanda Knox case, you also had that in the John Benet Ramsey case, you also had that in the Madeleine McCann case. So you say that I'm so scared there's somebody else out there, but then why don't you act like that? And so don't actions sometimes betray the truth in a totally different way? Actions speak louder than words, right?
That's why he called Rogan first the night of. He knows the only threat is him. I asked him if he could remember a line to all of those close to him, people that he trusted.
So I think this is quite clever. Can you guys see that the prosecution have actually turned their monitor towards the jury, and on the monitor are three different photos or screen grabs or scenarios of Murdaugh giving his versions of events, three different versions, and it says above their consciousness, I think, of guilt. I think that's what it says there. But that's actually what they're doing is while he's talking, they've got this image adjacent to the prosecutor. Quite clever, right?
They stole from. He couldn't detail one single conversation. He couldn't remember his last conversation at the kennels. To use his own words, and when you hear what he has to say, when he was asked after the kennel video and his new story, what he did, he said, "I got out of there."
I'm also intrigued that at this moment, Murdaugh's got glasses on. And as far as I know, those glasses are quite new. I may have missed something. Hasn't he sort of had sort of silver rimmed or sort of not the black frame glasses up until now? And, you know, if there's one thing that's going to, in a way, psychologically make you think, could someone have committed this crime? It's, in a way, putting glasses on them. We know Jodi Arias did that. We know Oscar did that. Oscar also wore glasses in trial. It kind of makes you think, well, he's not this lumbering 6'4" monster. He's a nerd, right? He's a harmless nerd. And I'm sure the moment I've said that, he's now going to take the glasses off, but we'll see. We'll see whether he's got those glasses on during closing arguments. Gayla says, I think it was both for him to have a distraction. I think it was what he might have thought. I have a totally different impression of him. I have an impression of a heartless manipulator. If you think about how he treated Connor, what's his name? Connor. Anyway, the other kid who was driving the boat. If you think about his attitude to Mallory Beach, kind of at the time when they said, well, we know kind of what her situation is. I don't really get the sense that he's a sensitive or compassionate figure to people outside of his own field of interest. So why does he suddenly, and a drug addict isn't compassionate anyway. Drug addicts are very, 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 very selfish people. My big gripe with this prosecution closing arguments is the absence of the word greed. To me, greed is the central explanation, and I don't really hear it being mentioned. That's kind of my problem with it.
He's got that photographic memory, but can't remember what he was doing when he was his most active.
Well, as I've said, now he's going to take off his glasses. But it'll be interesting if at the very end he puts them on. But we'll see.
On that day. He didn't say, if only I had been there. If only I had gone to the kennels. If only I could have stopped it. If only I had been there a little longer. He says, I got out of there. What father would hold anything back if he were innocent? What father would care what happens to him after that?
So he's starting to warm up in terms of the closing climax, right? This is it. This is the moment.
He claims he told you that he had cooperated with SLED. But he hadn't. There's nothing more important if someone's innocent to telling law enforcement when the last time the victims were alive. I just saw them. I saw them at 8:50. I saw them at 8:49. They're still out there. Go get them.
That's a fantastic argument, and I want to say it's intuitive, but it's kind of obvious. It's common sense, right? If you've been covering the case like the prosecutor, yeah, it's exactly, I must have just missed them. Where are they? Why doesn't he try and, he's got his gun in his hand when they arrive. Why isn't he making any effort to go after them? He's in a stationary, let's sit down and talk about this sort of thing. He doesn't like say to the officers on scene, I think they may have gone out that way. He doesn't direct them away. It's a little bit like the Koberger case, which is, well, have a look at the bodies, and when you're ready, I'll start talking. I'll start making my statement.
He mentioned paranoia and tried to convince you that there was paranoia about some case 10 years ago, and he confused David Owen with David Williams. He got on the stand, ladies and gentlemen, and as he got confronted with things, as he was allowed to keep talking, he kept adding a new factor and a new factor and a new factor to justify why he's lying to you, why he had lied to law enforcement, and to justify why he's telling you what he's telling you now. He kept adding them. He can remember those, ladies and gentlemen. He can remember a new one. He can remember this. And the problem with that is that there's no mistaking David Owen for David Williams. We showed you that.
So I can tell you, as someone who studied law, you need to be detail-oriented. One of the talents, I guess, one of the things you need in your arsenal is analysis. You need to be able to go through crap loads of information, right? Crap loads of information, and then filter that information as a lawyer, what is meaningful, what applies to the law, so you know the law like Bible verses, and then what can you apply to that aspect. So it's like a kind of surgery into the particular narrative, whether it's dealing with one of his cases or whatever it is. And in other words, lawyers tend to have very detail-oriented minds, as you can see with Waters, right? And of course, Murdaugh is like that as well. So when he can't remember details, that's when you really got to ask yourself a question. Why can't you remember a detail when you're so good at remembering details? Okay, so Gayla, thanks a lot for that. Gayla says, I think he loved them, but was in too deep. Yeah, so that's quite a good point, is you can, and I also think Chris Watts loved his family. I don't know if he loved his wife that much, but you can And I also think Casey Anthony loved Kaylee, right? It's a mistake to say someone murdered someone because they only had negative feelings. They can also have positive feelings, right? So it's not that black and white that he's just a monster and or he's a psychopath or something. I think the drugs made him psychopathic, but he was still someone capable of feeling feelings towards his younger son and capable of feeling feelings still towards his older son. Okay.
That picture of David Williams. This is a man who rides around with a badge in his windshield, who had blue lights installed on his private vehicle. And if you need any proof that he makes up lies and is very convincing with them and makes them up on the fly,
So I really don't know what he's writing down there. It's like Waters is saying, if you need any proof that he makes up lies, glasses come on. I'll need to take a note of this. Why is he saying I make up lies? Really, what is he on about? I don't know. It's strange.
the guy got caught flat-footed with the badge hanging out of his pocket. He tried to assert to you that sometime maybe it was an accident, that this badge is hanging out of his pocket. How was that an accident? See how quickly he was able to lie? But more importantly, the blue lights. He sat there and told you 3 times, I think he said his name 3 times, that Sheriff Smalls, the former sheriff of Hampton County, gave him permission to put blue lights in a private vehicle for a part-time assistant solicitor, and blue lights in a private vehicle.
So, yeah, you've got to ask yourself, is he smiling about that? Right? And it is quite a serious charge. You know, like if you're thinking about this whole thing, are we dealing with someone who thinks he's above the law, right? Are we dealing with someone who thinks that I've got this whole thing sewed up, I can wrap everyone around my little finger? Well, then you look at the whole thing of, well, he's got blue lights in his car, which means he kind of can act like law enforcement, but he's not law enforcement. Can I be allowed to act like law enforcement?
Vehicle. He told you 3 times, effortlessly got.
So I don't know if you can see that it does look like he's smiling, right? And that's the Murdaugh legacy. It is, yeah, we are above the law. It's great.
Up there, pivoted.
Yeah, he is complaining about something that he gets to enjoy. Isn't that what's going on here?
And lied.
Can you see that look on his face? There's a little bit of a thing going on there with that tilt of the head. Does he really need to make notes about that? What is he making notes about?
To you, because Sheriff Smalls came in here and said, of course not. That never happened. I've never heard of such a thing. This is a man who made his trade on lying. He lied about the most important fact in the case, and he sat there and effortlessly and easily pivoted to a new lie when confronted with something he wasn't prepared for.
It's a great point to emphasize as well that he lied about the most important fact of this case, which is, were you at the kennels or not?
And the sheriff came in here and said, no, that never happened.
Welcome, Cheryl.
Of course not. But he looked you all in the eyes and told you that. Looked you all in the eyes and told you that. As if, what's your problem, Mr. Waters? Sheriff Small said it was okay.
So this is also a very good tactic. It's one thing to say somebody lied to that person, but what if somebody lied to you? What if someone in court lied to you? they manipulated others, blah, blah, blah. Well, what if they try to manipulate you? How do you feel about that?
Tries to tell you that he was paranoid about having a bag of pills in his pocket. The man who had blue lights in his car and had a badge, rides around with a badge in his windshield. That's what he thinks of his power and prestige, and that's what he thinks of appropriate use of authority, is to put it up there. It only serves him. It's only there to serve him.
And that's also my kind of assessment of, if you say, I don't know, to me it's not something I would say that he killed Maggie and Paul for their own good or something like that. He did it because it served him. It was a heartless, horrible thing to do. He did it just because it served him.
But he's tried to also tell you that he gets paranoid, and so he's tried to lie about the most important fact that he could offer law enforcement when his wife and son were brutally murdered because he had a bag of pills in his pocket. But yet at the same breath says, I wasn't concerned about the law firm and that fair stuff. I'm not concerned about the boat case. Why would he lie about that time unless he's manufacturing an alibi?
So if we pull out of this just for a moment, we jump completely out of this whole case and we say, what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with a lawyer, right? And then you say, at what time did this lawyer allegedly murder his family? And you say, well, at the time that he was facing legal issues, and this is where you want to really stop everything and say, and I always say this in the cases we deal with, that you must always look at the identity of someone you're dealing with, right? If you want to solve a case, you need to, what's the word? You need to, I wonder if I should just do, you need to think about the person on their own terms. You don't think about them through your frame of reference. So if you're dealing with Brian Coburg, you need to think about it through the frame of reference of a student and other students doing what students are doing. If you're thinking about the John Benet Ramsey case, you need to think about it through the mind and spirit of a child, a 6-year-old and a 9, almost 10-year-old children, right? If you're thinking about the Amanda Knox case, same thing, students. And in this case, you need to think about it through the perspective of a lawyer, not what would make you afraid in a certain circumstance, what would your motives be, but what would the motives be of a lawyer? What would terrify a lawyer? What would be, what do they call it? The writing on the wall for a lawyer. Well, a lawyer getting sued for money that he doesn't have. A lawyer being up against a wall that is going to show his behavior. And so, just again, in a very, very basic sense, when does this crime happen in terms of the timeline? When does the crime happen? When something happens at his job, where they say to him, on the 7th, that same day, we're looking for this money and you need to give us, we need, we're aware that this money is missing. That's on the 7th. 3 days later, he's going to be audited. In a way, that is the end of the whole story. It's a lawyer who is facing legal action, serious legal action, serious legal bills that he couldn't afford. And then his entire life, his entire legacy is built on the law, but he's now facing legal ruin. And can he give that up? Can he say, look, sorry, you caught me, it's over? Can he face that? And that's where you say, well, didn't he become greedy in all this? That he wasn't just a normal lawyer, he wanted He wanted his cake and eat it. He wanted to be a lawyer and drive around like he owned the place. That scenario that I think is missing a little here is simplifying it in those layman's terms and also simplifying it within his terms. Someone who thinks he's above the law, someone who acts like he's above the law. Anyway, let's listen to the rest.
And that's just why it took him only 19 seconds to call 911, because he knew what he was going to find out there. This has all been constructed by him to try to confuse the situation. That lie that he told you, he tried to make it seem like he'd been trying to tell this, but he also admitted on the stand that, and as did his brother, that his own brothers heard it for the first time last week. That his own attorney was repeating the story that he was napping the whole time and never went to the kennels on HBO in November, just a couple months ago. A lot of people lie, ladies and gentlemen. A lot of people lie. When it's really important, something like this brutal murder, most people are going to come clean about a bag of pills. But why do people lie? People lie because they knew they did something wrong.
You know what I always say, not all liars are murderers, but all murderers are liars. And what is the level of lying in this particular case?
That's why he lied, ladies and gentlemen. And just like always, when confronted with new evidence that he no longer can deny, he backtracks, he pivots, and he tells a new story from that stand and looks you all in the eye. And then when new evidence comes up on cross, he backtracks and he pivots and he tells another new lie. And I'm sure if he could get up there again, he'd be telling, well, let me rephrase that. He said so many witnesses are lying on him. They're all lying on him. But the one thing we know is a constant is that he lied to them. Mark Tinsley's lying. Jeannie Seckinger's lying. Shelley Smith is lying. Blanca's lying. Everybody.
Also, it's like smile on his face here as well.
Everybody's lying on the master liar.
There you go. And now if you think about what's going on here, emotionally, psychologically, what's going on is there's a little guy. Now, Waters doesn't have any of the prestige of the Murdaughs, but in Murdaugh's mind, it's almost like he's the king. And some little guy is getting emotional about something he did do wrong, but it's kind of silly because look who I am, right? And so can you see that? Can you see how it's, yeah, well, it's true, but what do you think you can do about it? Ha, ha, ha. Did you see that? That says it all, doesn't it? Robin, welcome.
You heard him answer the questions about whether or not he killed his wife and son. You heard me ask him if he was a family annihilator. When he answers those questions, did you see him do this? Did you see him do that on those videos too, and ask questions where now we know he was lying?
I find that fascinating. It's kind of the true crime thing comes into the courtroom. Did you notice when I said that he did that? It's like the true crime thing has now, I don't know, welcome inside the courtroom. That's not really the stuff of prosecutors, that sort of thing, but it is effective. It definitely is effective.
Is that the most classic tell ever?
Is that the most classic tell ever? is kind of putting it in layman's terms, right? Is kind of feeding the jury the arguments that they're going to have for one another.
I'll leave that to you to decide. One thing I will agree with him that he said up there, oh, what a tangled web we weave when we first practice to deceive. How appropriate coming from that man.
See, so there it is again. He was building up, that wave was building, and now he's paging through his notes. You want to develop that momentum. You want to develop that emotion. So Rick says, does anyone have the feeling this could end the same way as it did in the OJ case? What do you guys say to that?
This man is trying to sell you on an idea that he was at the kennels, that he jetted back, that he went inside so quickly and quickly dozed off in the shortest nap in the history of the South. And then he got in his car just seconds after the supposed vigilantes. These vigilantes that apparently are 5'2", that knew somehow that Paul and Maggie would be both at Moselle on the evening of June 7th between 8:44 and 9:02, that also knew that they would be alone at this time. That they knew that Alec would not be at these kennels. And they also knew the property well enough to get to the kennels. They also assumed that they would find ammunition and guns there, so they didn't bring those. And they traveled the same route as Alec after his short 20-second nap, and knew that he would be visiting his mother at Alameda during that time. Those are the circumstances that you have to accept. The 5'2" vigilantes that arrived somehow in that tiny time period between 8:49 and 9:02, and that's given him every benefit of the doubt as to the story he told you, sprinkled with a bunch of new lies as well. That somehow they arrived during that time. The dogs never heard them or ran to them. Somebody put the dogs up in the wrong kennels. Somebody rolled up the hose. And these vigilantes were just lucky enough to find these family weapons there, which he's clear on the other side of it that he says were never there. He's so clear. Oh, we never had the blackout. We never rode around with the blackout.
So there you can see again, again, you've got to kind of think about the body language. What the defense want to try and convey is, this is a terrible closing argument. Ha ha ha. We're feeling confident. They want to try and convey that through their facial expressions. You saw that quite a lot in Depp versus Heard. That was a silly thing to say. It's amusing, whatever. Bear in mind the jury are looking at that. the jury, in a way, may not know what you think about certain things, so they take their cues. And then some people are giving off certain cues.
No one knew who he was. No one knew who this man was. He'd avoided accountability his whole life. He had relied on his family name. He had a powerful family. He carried a badge and used that authority. He lived a wealthy life. But now finally, he was facing complete ruin. His father, who he idolized, who I worked with on occasion, was dying. His son was facing charges for the boat case. He was facing a civil action that not only could potentially ruin him, but expose the reality of what he'd been doing for years. He had an opiate addiction. The entire illusion of his life was about to be altered. He couldn't live for that. He's the kind of person for which shame is an extraordinary provocation. Shame is an extraordinary provocation. His ego couldn't stand that, and he became a family annihilator. And I was thinking, that people who get the last word in this courtroom are y'all. And a lot of witnesses have testified over the last 6 weeks, but there's a couple that never get to testify that are important, and that's common sense and human nature. And there's 2 more that don't get to testify. We couldn't bring you any eyewitnesses because they were murdered. But common sense and human nature can speak on behalf of Maggie and Paul. When you look at this in its totality, common sense and human nature can speak for them. And they deserve a voice. Everything he did was meant to try to frustrate the forensics as a lawyer and a prosecutor, with the 2 guns and the manufactured alibi, and not taking his phone down to the scene, deleting call logs, making short phone calls, bringing up the boat case, moving Maggie's phone, changing clothes, looking at Paul's phone, calling Rogan, or trying to call Rogan. One man controlled this crime scene initially, and that was Alec.
Now, I don't know about you, but I would have tried to halve the time of this closing argument. One of the biggest arguments is that he seems to have manufactured an alibi. And I don't think that is a seams. I mean, him saying, I wasn't at the kennels, and then later saying he was, means it's common cause. It's undisputable that he was trying to manufacture an alibi. You could say that just stopped where he, that he just was at the kennel when he wasn't, and that's it. Or you can say he manufactured the whole rest of the alibi, all of those short calls, that flurry of internet activity. And I think that's where you really want to take the jury with you on your story and say, that's what happened here. Someone committed a crime, they manufactured an alibi, and who would know to do that better than a lawyer? Who would know how to do that better than a lawyer? And if you think about the manufacturing of an alibi and the manufacturing of a setup that is going to prevent the legal forces from coming to roost, in terms of the Mallory Beach case. So those forces coming to roost on the 10th. And then also the forces from his law firm coming to roost. Can you hear I'm making quite a more forceful argument than what he is? It's anchored in the roots of the case, but it's more of a narrative that works. He's got a list in front of him. He's kind of going down those points. And I don't know how effective that is, trying to stay on point in that sense. What do you guys think?
But there were some things he couldn't control. And we brought those to you. A couple things that the defendant said that I agree with. He said, whoever did this had anger in his heart. Whoever did this planned it for a long time. That he hurt the ones who were closest to him.
Another little bit of a smile there again, not that that's anything new.
It may be hard to fathom, ladies and gentlemen, that when you put all these circumstances together and really understand who he was in the entirety of his life, and the pressures that he was facing from what he had been doing for so long, you can understand it. There was one mistake, though, he didn't expect. And this is why he was worried about Paul's phone. This is why he's trying to get in touch with Rogan. And it was that kennel video that came up late in the investigation. One of the things I asked him and we've talked about this, the last question I had to him, and the first question I had to him was, what is the most important part of your testimony here today? And he wouldn't even concede that, but he at least conceded that the most important thing was to look you in the eye and try to explain to you why, after his entire history, you should believe him when he says, okay, I was down at the kennels for one brief minute, but I had nothing to do with this. We went through that long cross in which he identified all these factors, from his partner saying having an attorney, you need to have an attorney present, to his distrust of SLED, to Dave Owen asking him about his relationship, and asked him, at what point did you decide to lie? And he finally agreed, okay, it was in this interview. It was that moment in the June 8th interview. It was during.
So I think we've got about 5 minutes left of this closing. I must say it's unexpectedly running out of steam right now. I'm kind of getting quite bored. I thought and this is why I'm doing this live, I actually thought his opening was quite strong. I loved the way he was explaining the law. And I really wanted to touch on that, but I also wanted to touch on the end of his closing. I really didn't expect it to go on for so long. Anyway, let's listen into the last 5 minutes.
During that interview. But in his 911 call, ladies and gentlemen, at 10:06.
I just want to respond to this comment. Norma, I assume you haven't read any of my books. I think the psychology is one of the strongest contributions I make to the true crime genre. I think I've done that in the Idaho case. I think I've done that in the Chris Watts case and other cases as well, I think we can know the motive actually very well. But I think that relies on knowing the true identity of the person and the dynamics very well as well. That's not easy. It's definitely not easy knowing motive, but it's definitely not impossible either.
6. When he was asked when he last saw them, he said an hour and a half, and then changed it to approximately 2 hours. Consistent with what he would later say. Before any of those factors that he sat there and ran through with y'all as the reason for his decision even ever existed. And if that's not enough, ladies and gentlemen, you saw, and I played it for him, Daniel Green's body cam, where he was asked the same question. And he said that it was 1.5 hours plus 45 minutes. And all those factors that he identified to you as to why he supposedly lied, he was lying to you, ladies and gentlemen, when he made those up. He was lying to you when he made those up. Just like he's lied to everyone close to him. And he's good at it. He's good at it.
Do you guys agree? Do you guys agree that Murdaugh is a good liar? You guys agree with that? So in terms of the poll, how much would you give the prosecution closing out of 10? Most of you say 9 out of 10. Next is 8 out of 10. I think I would give him about 7 out of 10. Yeah, I thought it was moving to 8 in the beginning, but it sort of, as it went on, sort of went down to about 7. It's not that what he's saying isn't true, and it's not that what he's saying isn't, yeah, a valid argument. It's just the way he's saying it, the how of it, is a little wishy-washy and slow to my ears. But I mean, the argument itself is sound. It's very hard, and some of you will know this. You know, when you've written a book about a case and someone says, "Okay, tell me what the main insight is in 30 seconds." Very hard to do that when you're an analytical person. You want to provide all the little strands. It's very hard to do that. You've worked so hard to uncover all of these things. You want to flesh out every sort of octopus tentacle, and that's the tough part, is having the discipline to say, and the perspective to say it's this. And when you've just written a book, it's super hard to write a blurb. And I think it's the same thing when you've just presented a trial. It's very hard to come out of all of that noise, come out of all of that with a golden thread. It is difficult with a concise golden thread where there's some brevity in that.
Is that up?
So Caroline says Alex is not a good liar. He got used to being believed and so never had to be good at it. I tend to feel the same way. I feel like he's not a terribly good liar. I think exactly what you said there. Because of his influence, he's never really had to be a terribly good liar. Look how much he's actually been caught out on. Even if he beats the rap in terms of this case, I still think he's going to prison. Not because he's a good liar, but because he's not.
It was earlier tonight. I don't know the exact time, but I left. I was probably gone an hour and a half from my mom's, and I saw them about 45 minutes before that.
Okay.
I rode around with Paul.
So Graham says, I've never met a pathological liar like this guy. Well, you probably don't know any drug addicts. They're pathological liars as well. I also don't think it's, if you think about Buster and Alex's relationship, do you think it's because Alex is a good liar, or do you think it's because of the whole sort of spider web surrounding this case, the huge amounts of money? If you imagine, if you think about Paul's relationship with Morgan, do you think Morgan believed everything that he said, or do you think Morgan wanted to believe certain things that were 50-50 because you then got to enjoy the show, you got to enjoy the party if you agreed with him and if you believed him? Okay, while we're waiting for him to set that up, I do have audiobooks on Patreon. They're on the $5 tier and $10 tier, about 20, 21, 22 audiobooks. Mike says this was not a closing statement. See, all that dead air in the last 5 minutes, all that dead air, all of that, whatever momentum is built up, whatever argument is built up, now kind of goes out the back door.
Motive. The means. The opportunity. And ample evidence of guilty conduct and guilty conscience. All four factors.
So you can see while he's saying this, that is being presented as well. So I must apologize. Earlier I said if I was presenting this, I would provide kind of a framework. I see they are doing that to some extent. I don't know if they've done it as clearly as I would have wanted to do it, but they are certainly showing that to some extent. And that can be very powerful. You don't just say, you show. You don't just explain, you have pictures as well. You need that more and more in modern courtrooms.
Are present.
You've got to anticipate that your jury member has a short attention span. I've had to anticipate that as an author. You've got to shorten your chapters. You've got to, yeah. I mean, this is longer than a movie. Your closing's got to at least be shorter than a movie. Thanks for joining us, Patty.
And Maggie and Paul deserve a voice. They need a voice because they can no longer speak. And this has been a tough job. But the system depends on people who take that oath as jurors and are willing to honor that oath and make that tough decision to vindicate these victims, to vindicate Maggie and Paul, who were cut down in the prime of their lives. This is a sealed exhibit. This is what he did. This is what he did right here. This defendant, on the other hand, has fooled everyone who thought they were close to him, everyone who thought they knew he was who he was. He's fooled them all.
So I don't know if he's doing what I predicted he would do, which is show the crime scene and say, this is what he did. The photographer sort of cut off those screens. You can't quite see what's on them. But it does look like he has done that. I just don't think he's done it very effectively. It's the right thing to do, but I don't think he's built up to it very well.
And he fooled Maggie and Paul too. And they paid for it with their lives. Don't let him fool you too. On behalf of the state of South Carolina, I ask you to return a verdict of guilty against the defendant, Richard Alexander Murdaugh, for the murder of his wife, Maggie, and his son, Paul, and for his possession of firearms during the commission of those malicious offenses. Thank y'all for your attention during this long trial.
So I must say I'm underwhelmed. I thought his opening was quite strong. I'm talking about the opening arguments when the trial began. I think if he'd made it a third as long, and he sort of carried a narrative thread, a stronger narrative thread, because he has a strong case. I think he has just closed in a way that was sort of stuttering and unnecessarily lengthy. Anyway, what you want to do now is just look at the reactions from the Murdaugh team. You know, like you're probably going to see smiles. You're probably going to be like, "That's we've won. Yes, whoo." After that, we know that we've won this case. Let's see. Let's have a look.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, that will be it for this day. We'll resume at 9:30 tomorrow morning. If you go to the jury room, and you'll be dismissed in just a few minutes from the jury room. And please do not discuss the case at all with anyone, including your fellow jurors.
Okay, so do you think that the jurors are going to check out Twitter, check out what is trending on Twitter? Alex Murdaugh is guilty. Alex Murdaugh isn't guilty. That's the one thing to bear in mind. The other is, I think it is interesting that it does look like Waters elected to take up the whole day, right? That he wanted the whole space of the whole day to be his argument. And I think what he wants is the jury to absorb everything that he said. So it doesn't need to be a song and dance, and it doesn't need to be kind of a dramatic movie-like thing. I don't know if I agree with that. I suppose, I don't know if I agree with that. Is it good trial strategy to draw it out like that? Or is it better trial strategy to, in a way, I would personally say you rather want to not give Murdaugh's lawyers the chance to go home and adapt their closing argument. Give them time to do that. I would have tried to get them in a situation where they've got to respond that same day. That would be my personal strategy. But having said that, it's a complicated case. I don't know about you, but isn't it kind of less complicated than you thought in the beginning? Everybody said it's extremely complicated, but I don't know if it's that complicated. It's not complicated, but it's not like incredibly convoluted. That it's going to defy figuring it out. I mean, these documentaries have sort of provided the plot. It's not that difficult to figure out. Let's go through a lot of some of your comments. Okay, so I have been working on the 8, what can you call it? The 8 insights from the HBO docuseries. So I have, I've already narrated that. I'm just syncing the audio. So look out for that. I'll be putting that up quite soon. I'll probably be doing Van Gogh letters in the next 50 minutes. So those of you interested in that, it'll be a shorter than usual Van Gogh letters, but there is still time to do that. So about 50 minutes from now, we'll be doing Van Gogh letters. So I hope to see a lot of you guys then. It's on the Team Peachtree channel. So let me see if I can show you or give you guys the link. Sorry about that. I just want to give you guys, so the so now I'm wasting all the momentum myself. Okay, just trying to get the link to the video. It's number 38. Here it is. The time is wrong at the moment, but I will be changing it. So if you want to join me for Van Gogh letters, that'll be in about 45 minutes. Here is the link. It'll probably be about an hour to 90 minutes, that particular episode. Thanks for joining me. Thanks for the Super Chats Gala, and I'll see you guys next time. Ciao.